to supporting grieving students during this pandemic and offer some free resources for addressing these unique challenges. I want to start by saying that schools can provide a supportive environment to grieving students, but that doesn't require that classroom educators provide bereavement counseling, but rather that they provide an empathic presence to support children who are grieving. I often show a video of this one educator who I was interviewing, and she talked about how one of her students returned to middle school after he'd been absent for a period of time because of his mother's illness. And she found out when he returned to school that his mother had died during that time. And she was very caught off guard. She said she gave him a hug. She told him that how sorry she was, that she didn't know about it, and started to talk with him. And he just looked at her and said, "Please don't do this." So she didn't. And she just told him that, "I am here. We're all here to talk with you. My door is always open. Please let me know if I can help." She said a couple of weeks passed and he stopped by after school just to say thank you. And she asked him what she was being thanked for. And he just said, "I just want to say thank you." So she said, "Okay, you're welcome, but I don't know what I've done." And he just said, "You were here and I didn't have to talk about it." So she commented that she wished she had known that before. Sometimes you don't need to talk about it. You just need to be there for the child. And she gave really an excellent metaphor. She said, it's like a dance. I'll take the first step. If the student is ready to take the next step, then we continue the dance. Otherwise, we just stop and listen to the music together. And I think that's what a lot of educators are going to be doing with children now. They're just going to be listening to the music together. So as I go over this, the goal is not to try and suggest that people have to do counseling or therapy in their classrooms, but they do need to be sensitive, empathic, and supportive. So the first step in that is to acknowledge the loss. A common myth is that talking to children about their loss is going to upset them. But when you ask children how they're feeling, if they start crying after death's occurred, they're not upset about the question. They're upset about the death, and you're just giving them an opportunity to express that upset. But many children and their families may not notify the school when the child does experience a death. And many children and adolescents are not going to appear to be grieving. Let me go over why. Well, the first is that adults may communicate unwittingly to children that death is not to be openly discussed. If you think about it, if there's been a death in the family, say a parent has died, and the surviving parent sits down with a young child and explains what happened, and then the child just turns to his mother and says, "Does that mean that dad won't be home for my birthday?" And usually what happens is the mother then starts crying. And the child doesn't think that, they've asked an evocative question, which has shown the grief that his mother has and he has as well. Often children will just conclude, "I did something naughty. I made mommy cry. I won't do that again." And then the child tries to reassure and support the parent. And will say things like, "It's okay, Mom. I can do what Dad used to do. I'll make dinner. We're going to be okay." And so you realize that sometimes they just are trying to protect their parents. And often this gives a false impression to parents that their children are not grieving. Now, adolescents also try and protect their parents as well. I had one boy he was about 16 years of age. His brother died in an accident suddenly. And his mother was a nurse at the hospital I worked at. So she stayed out from work for a couple months and then finally returned. And after she had returned for a couple of weeks, she came in to speak with me about her other son and said that he was now all of a sudden having difficulty over his brother's death. He was having trouble sleeping, he was trouble eating, he was having trouble concentrating in class. So she brought him in and I asked him what had changed. And he said, "I don't know. I was doing fine for a period. And then all of a sudden it hit me." And so I just looked at him and I said, "Sometimes it's hard to see your parents grieve." And he just looked at me and said, "If I had one more night where my mother cried herself to sleep on my shoulder, I was going to lose it." Now, this boy actually had both parents still in the home, but he was a very empathic kid, and I think his mother was using him to try and get the support that she wanted, which is quite understandable. But children at all ages will often feel that this is something that you don't talk about. But there are many other reasons why children may not appear to be grieving. Very young children in particular may not yet understand what's happened, or at least understand all of its implications. When somebody dies, we not only lose the person that dies, that's what we call the primary loss, but we also lose everything that person did, used to do, could have done, or might have done in the future. Those are the secondary losses. And children don't often recognize the secondary losses as quickly as adults do. which is why they kind of grow into their grief and grieve over time. I remember one man, his wife had been killed in a car accident, and I was talking with him, and he said, "I live in dread of the day my daughter has her first period." His daughter was 5 years old, so she was not living in dread of that. She had no understanding that that was going to happen. But I do assure you that when she does have her first period, then she probably will acutely miss her mother again. So children may not yet understand it, or they may actually understand very well what's happened and its implications, and just simply feel so overwhelmed by their feelings that they don't feel like they can talk about it. Because if they start to talk about it, even with a counselor in school, they have to leave that room and go back to math class, for example. They might find that to be just too overwhelming. Children may also express their grief indirectly through their behavior or attempt to work out their feelings in play. So there are many games that children play about death, where death is the primary theme, and is a game that I'm sure you have all played with very young children, where the primary theme is around death. Starting when infants are first born, they don't seem to be born with what we call object permanence. They develop that in the second half of the first year of life. So when they're 3 months old, when a person leaves the room, even if it's an important attachment figure for them, they may appear to no longer recall that that person exists. It's kind of out of sight, it's out of mind, literally at that age. But once they start to develop object permanence, they recall that people who are important to them are missing when they wake up in the middle of the night. It's one of the reasons they start crying somewhere between, say, 5 to 9 months of age. And at that age, developmentally, children in all cultures around the world play the same game. In the United States, we call it peekaboo. And many people have said it's the first game about death. What happens is the child fixes their gaze on someone, there's separation as if the person has died, there's heightened concern and awareness, and then joy at reunion. And they play it over and over again. And people should ask why all children play the same game at the same point in development and why they have to keep playing it over and over. And it's because they're trying to deal with the concept of death. Now that may seem far-fetched to some people, but actually peekaboo is Old English, and when literally translated, it stands for alive or dead. That's what the game is about. There are many games that children play where death is a theme. Now, even if children understand it and they understand the implications of the loss, they may still choose to keep their losses as private, because in many ways, grief is a private experience. I worked with New York City after 9/11, and there were a number of children who discussed with their families and decided not to inform the school that their parent had died in the World Trade Center attacks, because the child did not want to be one of the 9/11 kids. So you'll find that there are many reasons why you don't know that a death has occurred, or you may not be seeing the child grieving in an obvious way. Now, many adults, in turn, don't want to talk about it or bring it up with children because they don't think they know what to say to make things better, and they're just afraid that they're going to make things worse by saying the wrong thing. So let me start now by talking a little bit about some well-intentioned comments that may actually not be the best to share with grieving students. Maybe if I go over what are the wrong things to say, you'll feel more comfortable that the alternatives can be safe to say. The first is don't try and cheer up survivors by making such statements as, "I know it hurts right now, but I know you'll feel better within a short period of time." Instead, allow them to grieve. Anything that begins with "at least" should probably be reconsidered. At least he's not in pain anymore. At least you still have your sister. Any of those comments really are ways for the person who is observing the grief to encourage the griever to stop showing their distress because it's uncomfortable to watch. But although it may be uncomfortable to watch, allowing expressions of feelings is what's helpful for the person who's grieving. So you don't want to encourage them to be strong or cover up their emotions. So you wouldn't want to say things like, you need to be strong, you don't want to cry in front of your mother. You should feel free to express your feelings and demonstrate your empathy, but don't state you know exactly how other people feel. Comments such as, "I realize this must be extremely difficult for you," or "I only can imagine how painful this must be," are good ways to demonstrate your empathy. But I would avoid statements such as, "I know exactly what you're going through," because you can't know someone else's feelings without asking them. You don't want to say things like, "You must be angry," because you're telling someone else how to feel. So you should let the person instead express their own feelings. Sometimes we try and share our personal loss experiences as a way to connect with individuals who are grieving. So you might find someone say something to a child, for example, both my parents died when I was your age. The problem with this is if you start to talk about your personal experiences, you set up a comparison. There's really only two ways that can go. Either you'll say something that pales in comparison. For example, a child experiences the death of a family member and you comment, well, my dog died this week and I understand. That would be seen as insulting. But when you say things like, both my parents died when I was your age, if the child has just experienced the death, say, of a grandparent, they may actually start to feel that the loss experience of the adult is larger or greater. And then they may feel the need to support the adult who's grieving. And so you don't want to compete for sympathy. And I'm talking about situations where there's been an acute loss and you're a professional in a school that's there to support a child. It's very different when you're talking with peers and your own family members, where mutual support is very appropriate. But I would say when you're working with children, keep your focus on the child's needs and their experience, especially when they're acutely grieving. What you really want to do is to allow the child, and if you're talking to the rest of the family, to be upset and suspend your judgment. Don't try and judge, is this normal or abnormal or the right way to grieve? Allow them to grieve in the way that they are. And intervene only when safety and health is concerned. But it is important to intervene when there is acute safety needs. If someone voices thoughts of self-harm, suicidal ideation, or homicidal threats, you need to intervene as though it is an emergency, because it is an emergency, even if they're grieving. And make sure you get a mental health professional involved who can do an assessment in a timely way to make sure that you preserve the safety of the individual and others around them. If someone is drinking, you want to make sure they're not getting in a car and driving. So you do want to make sure that you are attending to safety, but short of that, I would allow them to have their grief. Now, some people are also worried that they're going to say or do the wrong things because they feel ill-informed about another person's culture. And there are differences in cultural practices around bereavement, but the fundamental experience of grief is actually universal. When we recognize there's a range of ways to experience and express grief, then we can explore ways to bridge cultural differences in order to help grieving children and their families. So ask questions when you're unsure what would be most helpful for a family or individual. But the reality is that assumptions that are based on our beliefs of what a particular culture, ethnicity, or ethnic group does may actually result in assumptions that lead to stereotypes that cloud our perceptions and make us miss opportunities to be helpful. I was talking with an Amish family who had a young child who had been killed. And I was visiting the home at one point. And as I was walking through the home, the grandmother of the child who died pointed to a picture on the wall. She said, "This is a picture of my granddaughter who was killed." And she told me that, a while back, the grandchildren went over and they were playing outside. And she went outside to check on them. And there was a tourist who had stopped and was a photographer and was taking pictures. And so she stopped the tourist and she said, "Please, sir, we don't take pictures in the Amish culture. It's against our religion, our religious belief. We consider them to be graven images. And so I would ask you not to do it." And the grandchild who was playing just turned to her grandmother and said, pleaded with her, "Please, Grandma, let him take a picture. He said he's going to send me a copy. I don't have any pictures of myself." And the grandmother told me she was so embarrassed by this that she just reluctantly agreed. Then she pointed to the picture and she said, "What a gift from God, because if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have a picture of my granddaughter to remember her." Now, the point is, if I had entered into that interaction with the assumption that the Amish do not use photographs as transitional objects after a death has occurred to help them with their grief because of their culture and because of their religious beliefs, then I would have never had given this woman the opportunity to share with me that that's what she was doing. So I recommend that we approach families with an open mind and an open heart and help them identify and communicate what is important to them about their cultural practices, and then work with them to find solutions and compromises when realities require modification in cultural practices. For example, during this pandemic, it may not be safe to have family members clean or prepare the body for funeral, hold large funeral ceremonies, sit Shiva, or visit grieving families to bring over food. But what we have been seeing is ways to adapt this. So we've seen virtual services, even virtual Shiva, and coordination of meal delivery through online services. So what we can do is ask people about their practices. We don't need to know them ahead of time. We just need to be sensitive that there are differences and stay open to understand how to try and help people achieve what they hope to in their practices. Now, I've just reviewed that you should say something, and I've given you some guidelines of what not to say. So let me now talk about some ways you can start the conversation when you are ready to do that. The first thing is express concern. Let students know you've heard about their loss and you're available to listen and offer support. Be genuine. Children can tell when adults are authentic in their communications. If a child tells you that his uncle died, don't turn to him and say, that you miss the uncle too, because then the child's going to look at you and say, did you ever meet him? And if you say no, then obviously you weren't being genuine in your concern. But you can tell the child that you're sad that he's experienced a loss that's meaningful to him. You want to invite conversation, so use simple, direct, open-ended questions, such as asking, how are you and your family doing? Listen and observe. You actually want to listen more and talk less. Share observations about students' behavior or responses if you wish to, but do it in a non-judgmental manner, such as, I noticed you've been quieter in class. Can you tell me what you're thinking? Limit your personal sharing. As I mentioned, you can draw on personal experiences to help you better understand students, but try not to share them with the children directly, and keep the focus on the student and their experience. You can offer practical advice. For example, you can discuss ways to respond to questions from peers or adults about the death. Educators can talk with peers and help them learn how to become more comfortable supporting a grieving friend. Just like adults, they may feel uncomfortable. But children want to help their friends, even though they have limited experience supporting a friend who's grieving. They may therefore make insensitive comments, ask repetitive or intrusive questions about the death, or sometimes even tease the grieving peer. In one study of children ages 6 to 15 who had experienced the death of a parent, 20% reported that they had experienced direct, raw taunting about their loss. Peers may also distance themselves from the grieving child to cope with their own anxieties or discomfort. So educators can help students develop skills to support a peer who's grieving by correcting misinformation and misunderstandings and helping students understand how to be supportive of their peer. For example, going over what to say and what not to say to someone who's grieving. You can offer reassurance to children without minimizing their concerns. Let students know that over time, they will be better able to cope with their distress and that you'll be there to help them during their process. And then maintain contact. At first, children may not accept your invitation to talk or your offers of support, but their questions will evolve over time. So remain available, concerned, and connected. Now, when supporting grieving students, it's also important to identify and address guilt reactions. Young children tend to be very egocentric and assume that they control external events through their actions and thoughts. They may also have limited understanding of the true cause of death. In order to make some sense of the death of someone close to them, children will often elaborate explanations that rely on what we refer to as magical thinking based on their egocentrism. And they may assume that there was something they did not do, or should have done that would have in some way prevented the death of someone close to them. And this results in guilt after a death. Even older children and adults often feel guilty when there's no logical, objective reason for them to feel responsible for a death. As I mentioned in the prior webinar, people may assume some responsibility, at least unconsciously, because it helps them to believe that by taking different actions than they had taken before, they can prevent the future deaths of others about whom they care deeply, and therefore they'll feel more in control. I saw one second grade child. He was a very bright boy. His mother was a child psychologist on the faculty at the medical school. The father was very engaged, also worked in another medical school in the city, and they had a child, an infant who had died of sudden infant death syndrome. They explained this to their child in the most developmentally appropriate way you could imagine. They were very supportive. He was having no significant distress, but they brought him in just to talk with me because they wanted to make sure they did everything possible to support their child. And I remember on the first visit, he was very open. He told me what SIDS was. He told me what the acronym stood for. He told me about the fundraisers to find research, to conduct research to find the cause. He clearly had been given a lot of information. And I also remember on the first visit, he looked at me and he said, "My mother's about to have another child." I said, "Yeah, she looks like she's at the end of her pregnancy. What do you think about that?" And he said, I think my mother's trying to replace my brother that died." And I asked him, "Can you do that?" He said, "Of course you can't do that, but that's what I think my mother is doing." So here he had insight into his mother's actions. He was precocious in his understanding. He actually even asked me to do an in-service to his second grade classroom about what death means and why it happens. So he was clearly a very advanced kid. And on the second session at the end, I just looked at him and I said, "So why did your brother die?" And he just looked at me and he said, "Because I went to camp that day." SIDS' death of unknown cause. He really didn't understand why his brother had died. No one did. And because he didn't understand why, he assumed it was his fault. Now, children who experience the death of a family member during the pandemic may question how they may have inadvertently exposed a family member to the virus, how they should have picked up on symptoms before the illness became serious, or wondered what they ought to have done to get help earlier on in the illness for their family member. This guilt continues to be extremely common, even among adolescents and adults. And for these reasons, it's often helpful to reassure children and adults of their lack of responsibility for a death. I did one presentation to a third and fourth grade class about what happens when someone dies and how we feel and how we can get support. And afterwards, the children wrote letters and the teacher sent them to me. And one of the girls just wrote, "Now that he just said, Dr. Schonfeld, thank you for coming to my class and telling me what happens when someone dies. Now I understand it's not my fault. My father killed himself." And then she just wrote, "Have a happy Valentine's Day," and signed her name. So the issue is simple comments to individuals about guilt reactions being common may not really solve or deal with all the guilt that children have, such as the guilt that children often will feel after the death by suicide of a parent. But it actually is enough for them to start to verbalize it and then get some support for it. For example, in that class, what I had said to children is that when someone dies or something bad happens, we often feel badly. But bad things don't make bad things happen. Bad thoughts and feelings don't make bad things happen. And I said, children don't cause death because of their thoughts or their concerns. But many children still feel that way. I also often say to people that feeling guilty doesn't mean you are guilty. People almost always feel guilty, but generally they are not responsible. So I do think it's important that you mention this and talk about it with individuals. Let me turn now to some of the academic reactions that you're going to see. And it's very common for students to experience at least temporary academic challenges after the death of a close family member or friend. And you're going to likely also see this, by the way, from the majority of students dealing with a major crisis such as the pandemic. Pre-existing learning challenges often become worse as well. And this may be due to difficulty concentrating because of disrupted sleep, anxiety, depression, etc. Difficulty learning, remembering, or applying concepts. Challenges with completing homework because of competing obligations. For example, students may have to help take care of younger peers after a parent has died in the household. They may have more chores. There may also be a lack of availability of parental assistance, either because there's only one instead of two adults in the home, or because the adults who are remaining there are sad and having difficulty as well. You can also see disrupted home environments, particularly if students need to move. And children may also demonstrate difficulty on showing what they've learned on tests. So for many reasons, children may have at least temporary academic challenges. And it's important to offer academic support proactively. Don't wait for students to begin demonstrating academic challenges or for academic challenges to actually become academic failure. Schools can and should be a source of valuable support to grieving or traumatized students. But if academic expectations, even temporarily, exceed students' capacity to learn, school is actually more likely to become an additional source of distress. So assist grieving students in identifying the level of academic work that feels appropriate and achievable. Let me go over just a few of the helpful accommodations you might wish to consider, and these may have been discussed in the prior webinar as well, because they also apply to all children during the pandemic. You may need to change an assignment. For example, allow a student to work on a project with a partner rather than solo if they're having trouble concentrating when they work alone. Some children, on the other hand, feel uncomfortable with social interactions while they're grieving, and they may actually want an individual project instead of a group project. You can suggest a student adapt a formal research paper into something that's more engaging, like an oral history project or a video assignment. But you may have some children who are grieving who feel self-conscious or uncomfortable in front of groups because while they're grieving, and they may actually not want to have an oral project and may instead want something in writing. So the point I'm trying to make is not that there are particular accommodations that work for all students, but simply that you need to talk to students and see what accommodations would work for them. You may want to change the focus or timing of a lesson. A literature class might choose a different book to discuss if the one originally scheduled describes a death similar to the one a student is currently grieving. A health class on the dangers of substance abuse might be postponed, or the grieving student excused if he's just lost a sibling to a drug overdose. So think about what might trigger some of the feelings that children have about this loss. You can reschedule or adapt tests. Immediately after a death, students might be exempted from some testing or given modifications, such as testing alone in a quiet location with extra time. Scores might be omitted or weighted less into determining their final grades. Consider 504 plans, or for children already in an IEP, modifications in the student's IEP. It's important for teachers to find a balance between maintaining reasonable expectations and being ready to provide additional support and accommodations for grieving students. And that is a difficult balance to find, but you're much more likely to find it if you talk to the child and their family. So let me turn now to grief triggers that you may see in the classroom setting. Grief triggers are sudden reminders of someone who died that can cause temporary but still powerful emotional responses in children who are grieving. Since grief triggers can be anything that reminds children of the person that died, such as a song the mother used to sing, a country they visited on vacation with their cousin that gets brought up in social studies class, a poem in class that discusses in passing the friendship of siblings after the death of a sibling, or a reminder by a teacher for students to simply have their parents sign a permission slip will remind a child if a parent has died. And these are hard to predict, and they often catch children off guard, and even very thoughtful teachers may say something that prompts this. You know, I interviewed one child, she was an adolescent, she was talking about she was in biology class, and they were doing a lesson on blood vessels. And she said during the lesson, the teacher was talking about blood vessels and mentioned aneurysms and asked the students if anyone knew what an aneurysm was. So she raised her hand and she described what an aneurysm was. And then the teacher asked her, you know, what can happen if you have an aneurysm? So the girl explained that if it's in a delicate and important organ such as the brain, if the aneurysm leaks or bursts, then the person might die from it. And then she just looked at me and she said, you know, it's just ironic. Somebody can say something that means so little to them, yet it means so much to you. And she said, my teacher didn't realize that my father died of a brain aneurysm. And so she just kind of said, teacher didn't realize that. I completely understand. And of course, it's appropriate to talk about aneurysms during a biology class on blood vessels, but it really was difficult for her. And I will tell you that I assume the teacher never knew if this even happened. It was based on the way she told me the story during an interview that was videotaped. She didn't look upset. And then I just kind of asked her, have you ever had grief triggers like that before or since then? And she looked at me and she goes, oh yeah, actually today, before I came here, I was talking to my friend. She's my best friend. And we were joking about a test that we had. And my friend started, saying, oh, I'm gonna have a heart attack. And it's such a bad test. And then she said, her friend said, I'm gonna have a brain aneurysm. And she started shaking. And the girl looked at me and she said, this is my best friend. She doesn't know that's how my father died. I never told her that. So I'm not upset that she did that. But you can imagine that that can happen on a daily basis to kids. And so what do you do with grief triggers? You can't just not talk in class. That's not going to work. So you have to bring up things. So the first thing I would say is, why don't you, you can explain to children that it's expected that such triggers can occur, and then develop a safety plan on how you're going to deal with them so that children feel more in control and less overwhelmed. So this slide goes over some of the helpful responses for the planning. So what you may do is identify a safe space or location where the student can go, such as to the school social workers or counselor's room, the library, or the classroom across the hall, or perhaps just in the back of the room. You may have problems with mobility during the pandemic, so you may not allow children to just leave the class and go sit in the library, for example. But you can find at least a space in the room where they can sit that's quiet and allows them some time to themselves. Or you may want to find an adult that the child can talk to when they're feeling upset or wanting to talk, or set procedures for the student to obtain support. You want to do this in a discreet way so that the student doesn't draw attention to themselves when they're about to cry. So I remember one teacher told me they worked out a plan, and the boy would just take a tissue from the tissue box near the door and leave the classroom. And she knew he was having a grief trigger and knew where he was going. You may let the student call a parent or other family member if that's necessary, or provide permission and encouragement to see the social worker, counselor, and nurse outside of class, and offer private time to talk about thoughts, feelings, and concerns with the teacher. I had one teacher tell me he was in a class, he was teaching a class, and he had a student in there whose father had died recently. And what he worked out with her was that she wore a hoodie to class, and when she was feeling particularly overwhelmed, she just put the hood up. And they called it, between the two of them, a hoodie moment. And when she had the hood up, that was her way of communicating. She wasn't accessible at that point, and he agreed he would not call on her when the hood was up. And then when she put the hood down, she was ready to participate more actively, and he could call on her. And he just looked at me and he said, you know, it's better than her sitting at home grieving by herself, and at least she's getting some of the educational content. You know, I'm going to respect her ability to tell me the level that she's able to participate. Now, for those of you who may still be doing virtual courses, you can also do this on virtual courses. For many years, I taught a course on supporting grieving students for graduate students, and it was all on the virtual academic platform. And there were a couple situations where students in that class contacted me the morning of the class to let me know that either they had a family member who was terminally ill or someone who had just recently died. I, of course, excused them from the class, but in several situations, they said they still wanted to participate. They actually thought the information was now even more relevant to them. And what we chose to do is they just left their camera off. And that way they could step away from the class whenever they felt that it was overwhelming or not helpful to them at the time. But they could stay engaged to the level they wanted, and they didn't feel self-conscious that one of their classmates might see them crying or upset. Now, staff can also work with children and their families to help anticipate and minimize likely grief triggers. So if you're going to do an activity at Father's Day, around Father's Day, for example, where you ask students to write a poem about their dad, or a story or a letter, you need to recognize that some children may have a father who had died or who they don't know. So you can certainly start that assignment by just saying, there may be some of you who don't have a father that's alive or currently living with you. You can still do this thinking about your memories of your dad, or you can pick another man in your life that was important and supported you. That way we can all do the activity. Once we get started, you can let me know if you have any other questions. So you plant the notion that there may be individuals who have personal life experiences that impact them, and you give them some sense of how they can still become engaged in the project. And that's useful not only if a parent has died, but would be useful if a child, for example, never knew who their dad was. Maybe they were conceived artificially and they don't actually know who their dad is. Or maybe their dad is divorced or moved out of state or is incarcerated, incapacitated in some way, has been deployed overseas. There are many reasons why children may feel sensitive to an assignment such as that. And so you want to just set up in a considerate way that you've thought of that. And so thinking about both grief triggers and trauma triggers is really important. I actually worked with one school that had a mass shooting, and even before they reopened the school, like a week or two later, the principal knew enough and acted on my recommendations that he actually had the teachers, I don't know if it was all the teachers or just department heads, go through the curriculum for the entire year and consider and remove whenever possible all likely triggers. And they did this openly. They shared it with the students. One of the students from the school newspaper actually interviewed me about this and asked, how long should you do this for? How is this usually done? I didn't have the heart to tell her that I don't think it's usually done. It's usually recommended by me, but I don't think people have the wherewithal to actually do that. And I remember she said to me that they had a forensic science course. And how could you really remove all the likely trauma triggers to talk about murder in that situation? And so, I mean, the sensitivity that people can have is really, there is a lot you can do if you think about it. Now, I've spent all this time talking about general considerations about how to support grieving students. So let me turn now to some unique challenges of supporting grieving students during the pandemic and some free resources from the Coalition to support grieving students that can be used to address these challenges. At the end of this presentation, and my intention is to end in about 20 minutes, so we have plenty of time for questions and discussion. So please start entering your questions in the chat box if you can. That would be helpful, and then we'll get to those questions. But I do want to say that when I'm done with the presentation, I'm going to show you how you can download for free a guide that goes over the different challenges that I'm now going to present, as well as some of the specific resources from the Coalition to address each of those challenges. So I'm going to go quickly through the different resources and what I'm saying now, but don't worry, you'll be able to download that information. Now, after the death of someone close in any setting, children often become more concerned about their health and that of others that they care about. But in the setting of a pandemic, there's already often extreme concerns about personal health and that of others. So the ability to reassure children that others close to them are healthy and not at risk of dying as well becomes even more challenging, even if the initial death was unrelated to the pandemic or even to infectious disease in general, such as an individual or family member that dies in a car accident. So it becomes important to help children deal with their fears and concerns about the pandemic in addition to any grief they may be experiencing after a personal loss. The COVID-19 Pandemic Resources webpage on the Coalition website includes presentations and materials for educators, parents, and other professionals on how to talk to and support children during this pandemic. And this was a lot of what I reviewed in the prior webinar. This information will help address children's anxiety related to the pandemic, whether they're grieving a personal loss or worried about the deaths they see reported in the media. Physical distancing measures, including lengthy school closures, increases the social isolation that's generally experienced by grieving children outside of the context of the pandemic, and it also makes it difficult for schools to provide support using traditional means. While this is certainly true, it's often also true that schools provide meaningful support to grieving students when deaths occur during summer vacation and holiday breaks, using phone, email, and the internet. And the support, quite honestly, we provide to parents and guardians and other family members is generally not delivered in person, even outside the context of a pandemic. These same strategies can be used during a pandemic when school closures are required, and they're outlined in the Coalition materials. Now, many children's bereavement programs across the country are quickly adapting to the pandemic by providing virtual groups and/or individual support. You can contact the organizations in your area to see how they can assist, even while schools are closed. You can check the National Bereavement Resource Guide, which is a state-by-state bereavement listing compiled by New York Life and Aluna, for a list of bereavement organizations in your state to identify local support for bereaved children and their families. And the link is in the material I'm going to refer to at the end. I already talked about secondary losses, and they may become even more of an issue during a pandemic. After the death of a close family member or friend, children need not only to cope with the loss of the person that died, but also the loss of everything that person did or could have done. And during a pandemic that requires physical distancing and school closures, the magnitude and importance of these secondary losses may become quite accentuated. Families may find significant challenges to meeting basic needs, such as obtaining food, preparing meals, providing supervision in the home, especially when the parent or parents are grieving and feeling overwhelmed by the pandemic themselves. And I should just say parenthetically that when I refer to parent, I'm talking about parent, guardian, grandparent, aunts and uncles, any adults that take on a supervisory role. I'm just going to say parent for ease. The usual outpouring of assistance, support, and companionship that would normally be provided by extended family, friends, neighbors, and members of the school community in the at least immediate aftermath of a death may not be able to occur. Funerals may need to be postponed and family and friends unable to visit. So the coalition module that we have on secondary and cumulative losses addresses this challenge of the secondary losses. Family members may also be overwhelmed by the pandemic in addition to their own grief. Surviving parents not only have to deal with their grief, but they have to deal with the impact of the pandemic. Worries about their own health and others they care about and for, such as their own parents, financial implications, practical concerns such as how to obtain food and needed services, all while caring for grieving children. Extended family and friends are likely to be personally preoccupied with the pandemic and other associated crisis events that may be occurring at the same time, such as around racial concerns, for example. Extended family and friends may be so preoccupied that they are unable to, and they're focusing on meeting their needs and the needs of their own family. They may not be as accessible to even call or provide the type of remote support that they might otherwise provide to grieving families. And so the role of school professionals then therefore becomes even more important in this context. So resources for meeting basic needs are often the first component of mental health services in the aftermath of any crisis or loss, and is something you should be considering as a primary focus. Now, some children's grief may not be related to a loss due to death. For some children who don't experience the death of someone they know, they may still have to cope with separation from loved ones due to hospitalization, quarantine, travel restrictions, or just the inability to visit older relatives or friends who live nearby. They may also grieve their inability to celebrate their graduation, their birthday, or special holidays. And transitions such as from high school to college may be particularly challenging during a pandemic. The website for the coalition has a guidance document addressing these other losses, which are referred to in the field as ambiguous loss. There's also a module on coordinating services and supporting transitions, which discusses how to support grieving students as they transition to new grades in new schools. And lastly, in this section, supporting grieving students can be difficult in the best of times, and this is clearly not the best of times. This is a particularly difficult but critical time to maintain your professional self-care. Some of the ways that school professionals meet their self-care needs is through the community of professionals within their school, but that requires some active effort on your part due to the physical distancing that's occurring during the pandemic. The impact of this pandemic is going to be longer than perhaps most of us are prepared to accept, so we really have to start on professional self-care now. There is a module on the coalition website on professional self-care, and it offers some suggestions for strategies for professional self-care, which is a topic that I just discussed in length on the prior webinar. Now, the Coalition to Support Grieving Students is a resource that I wanted to make you aware of. It's a unique collaboration of the leading professional organizations representing classroom educators, including teachers, paraprofessionals, and other instructional staff. See, the AFT and NEA are two of the founding members. Principals, assistant principals, superintendents, school board members, central office staff, and student support personnel. So you'll see the School Superintendents Association, the National Association for Elementary and Secondary School Principals, as well as the American Federation of School Administrators, and groups representing school counselors, school nurses, school psychologists, school social workers, and other student support personnel that are all listed on this slide. And these groups came together more than 5 years ago with a common conviction that grieving students need the support of the school community. So in addition to these founding members, when the website was launched about 5 years ago, other groups voiced an interest in belonging to the coalition, and these are just some of the other supporting organizational members, that include groups like the American Academy of Pediatrics, Save the Children, etc. We have now 100 members, organizations in the coalition. The coalition created a free school practitioner-oriented website, grievingstudents.org, that houses over 20 video-based training modules, most of which are only 10 to 15 minutes in length and can be easily watched to just deal with a particular topic. The modules are grouped into 6 sections, each containing 2 to 4 individual video modules. The topic categories addressed within the 6 sections are listed in this slide. Each of the videos is also accompanied by a PDF handout that summarizes the major points of the module for those who would prefer to read the information instead. There's a section on conversation and support, which includes actor simulations of teachers talking to children when they return to school about a death of a parent. This video is actually 30 minutes long because of the actor simulations. We also have videos here on advice on what not to say to a grieving child, how to provide support over time, and how to facilitate peer support. The next section is on developmental and cultural considerations. There's a section on practical considerations, including funeral attendance, secondary and cumulative losses, and the coordinating services and supporting transitions, as well as one on the role of social media in supporting grieving students. There's another section on reactions and triggers, which talks about the impact on learning, guilt and shame, other reactions, and grief triggers. There's a section on professional preparation and self-care, and a final section on crisis and other special circumstances, which talks about bereavement in the context of a school crisis, suicide, how to facilitate commemoration and memorialization in school settings, and how to address students with potentially life-limiting conditions who have a risk of dying. Now, in addition to the video modules and the associated print materials, the website also includes selected other resources. We have additional modules on how to deal with death in line of duty for police and military, guidance documents on practical guidelines developed by the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement on how to respond to the death of a student or staff member from all causes, as well as one specifically related to suicide. There are free teacher training modules that can be used for sharing this information with educators and other school staff. There are family and school staff booklets, which can also be downloaded in both PDF formats to email or to share or to photocopy, as well as you can order them for free from the fulfillment center from the New York Life Foundation. They actually will pay the shipping and handling as well. And there are articles and other online resources. This is one booklet. You just go to grievingstudents.org. Underneath the photographs that rotate, you'll find a button that says order free material. You click on that, and this is a booklet for parents. It's available in English and Spanish, both in print copy for free, as well as for download in a PDF. And this last slide I showed on the prior webinar, which just shows some contact information for the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. What I'd like to do now is open it up to questions that people either have already entered into the chat box, and I encourage you, if you have questions that you haven't entered, to please do that now.
Thank you, Dr. Schonfeld. We've got a number of co-hosts that are monitoring the chat box this morning, so feel free to type questions. If we could have Beth and Molly and Tim take a peek at those. Do we have anything in the queue right now, Beth?
Yeah, so Molly, did you want to take the first and I'll take the next?
Sure, I can take the first one. First one is, my student services team has been approaching admin about addressing staff and students about grief before we return to the building. Administration is resistant. Any thoughts about how to help us advocate for grief support?
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons I mentioned all the a lot of the member organizations within the coalition to support grieving students, because it does include the School Superintendents Association, the National Association for Elementary School Principals, the National Association for Secondary School Principals, and the American Federation of School Administrators. They have not only participated in the development of this material, they've actually endorsed it and placed their logo on it. So that's part of what you can do, is say to administrators, look, this is material that's been endorsed by school administrators. And so we really want to make sure that we get that material out. Having said that, I can completely understand right now, and I've talked to groups of superintendents, for example, with similar types of webinars. This is a really hard time to be a school administrator. And sometimes it just feels so overwhelming that you don't want to try and do anything. You may feel that during the summer is just a time for people to, quote, relax, although it's not a particularly relaxing time right now. Or it may be that you're just afraid you're going to say or do the wrong thing. If you try and bring it up, there will be some people who are upset because they're upset about what's happened. So I think part of it is to, as you approach the administration, understand their hesitancy may be a sign of discomfort because they may not know exactly what to do. So you have to partner with them, say that you will help them, but recognize it's a hard decision about how to do this. I might not focus so much on talking about grief as much as focus on providing support. I think if you say, we have to talk about the fact that we're all grieving, that may not be what people want at this point. But to say that we're all stressed and there's many things that have been challenges for us and we want to talk about how we're here to help each other, I think was more likely to be something that school administrators will take on. And then the last thing I'll say about that is you need to give them some sense of what to do. I was in a group, when I was in Connecticut, when 9/11 happened, I was put on a state task force to talk about how to support kids dealing with 9/11 in the state of Connecticut. And there was, it was a group of about 8 to 10 people, somewhere around that. And I know it was a couple months afterwards, and we were talking about how kids seemed to be adjusting. And the superintendent who had been appointed to the group, who was really an excellent superintendent, and that's why she was selected to represent the state, she just said, I think we're pretty much back to the way we were. I don't know that we need to talk about it anymore. The kids are doing well, and the staff are back to normal. And I just looked at her and I said, that's great to hear, because I hear a lot of teachers are still upset and yelling a bit more at the students, and people are feeling frustrated. So could you just share with us what you did in your school district that got teachers to that point? Because that would be great if we could learn that. And she just looked at me and, with the group, and she just said, okay, I lied. They're not back to the way they were. She said, I've been a superintendent for like 15, 20 years, and this is the first time where I don't have any idea of what to do. So I just said that, and I'm going to take it back, because if you can tell me what to do, then I will do it. But quite honestly, I don't know how to make this any better anymore. So I think there's a certain amount is go forward with some of the resources that are there, offer to provide some assistance. And the other thing which I tell people, because I've gotten this a lot, is let's just wait until the first day when we reopen, and let's just prepare for that, because there's a lot to do to prepare for that. But then I tell people, you're asking kids to wait 6 months after the pandemic started before we start to help them with it. I just think that's way too long. I don't think that's fair to kids. And besides, if you don't talk about something for 6 months, kids are going to think you don't want to talk about it. They pick up on that. So even when they come back, they won't share because their teachers were not there for them to discuss it for 6 months. So I do think it's important to first recognize where the resistance and hesitancy comes from and offer some concrete solutions and things and approaches that you can take.
Thank you, Dr. Schonfeld. Beth, have you got question number 2?
Yep, unmuted myself. Do you have any specific advice for parents who are currently guiding their children through the grief they're experiencing and missing their friends, teachers, some family members, and the fear that they may never go back to school as usual?
Okay. So first off, I think you need to acknowledge it with children of any age. Even very young children, kindergartners, you could say, I know you feel very sad about that. It's hard to you miss your friends, and I miss being with my friends as well. I know that's difficult. So first, give it voice, acknowledge it. Don't try and minimize it. There is a tendency to try and either cheer them up and go, well, I know it's bad, but we get to we get to cook every day, but that's not, they want to be with their friends. And so it's not a competition. So don't try and say it's really okay when it's not. So be honest about that. There is a tendency for us to say things like, well, you miss seeing your friends. Well, there's some children whose parents have died. You should feel grateful that didn't happen. You know, I think when you try and contrast it and say that it's worse for other people, I guess some people think that makes you feel better. It doesn't. It actually just makes you feel selfish, and it makes it very unlikely that you're really going to share your feelings if it's minimized in that way. So first thing is give voice to it, listen to it, and then also recognize sometimes children are not actually looking for answers to questions. They are rhetorical questions. So if they say, well, why do I have to go through this? You know, you can sit down and start explaining why we are all vulnerable to the virus and we each, but if they already know that, they're just voicing that it feels unfair. And so sometimes you just need to listen to children about what's upsetting them. And then when they're ready, you can try and think through some things that you can do that might make things more tolerable. And say, well, I know you can't see your friends, but I think in a week or two, we may be able to go outside and have one friend over. And if you can, at least you can talk to them, but you'll have to stay, 6 feet apart and wear a mask. Would you like to do that? So you can try and figure out ways of doing things remotely and other activities you can do to stay connected. But I think the main thing is to listen to them and let them voice what's concerning to them.
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah, hi, Dr. Schonfeld. Next question up is regarding triggers. Does removing triggers from the curriculum impact the student's ability to develop coping skills when experiencing triggers? So I guess the question there is about, should you try and remove triggers?
Yeah, so I think you should try and remove kind of obvious, significant triggers from the curriculum. I went to one school where a child had been shot in the head and was killed during a hostage situation. And one of the teachers came up afterwards and he said, normally the book I would teach now is of mice and men, but I know that one character shoots his friend in the head. Should I avoid teaching that now? And I didn't say anything. And he said, oh my God, that question, now that I've asked it, that sounds so stupid. Of course I shouldn't teach it. So I think there are just some obvious triggers that are unnecessary. I was in one community that had massive wildfires. Up to 90% of one of the communities was destroyed. And they didn't have hotel space because everyone was in the hotels and FEMA was there. And so I was staying in someone's home who worked for the school. And I was in the bedroom of one of the kids that was at college. And right as I fell asleep, I looked up and the book that I saw on the bookshelf was Fahrenheit 451. And I thought, okay, that's not a good book to have right over your bed if your neighborhood just burned down. So, I mean, there's some certain triggers that are kind of obvious that we should probably be sensitive to. I know, for example, there are places where there have been mass shootings and they have a Holocaust course. And so you just have to be sensitive to the fact that's just harder to talk about in that situation. But I do agree you don't want to remove everything that could possibly be a trigger, because children do have to interact with others out in the world and they are going to eventually be exposed to some of this. So I don't think you can eliminate everything, but I think you should eliminate the most obvious ones and also let children know that, I'm going to be teaching, we're going to continue with our class in social studies. And I do recognize the fact that we do talk about wars and other places of violence and where people die. And if this is just hard for you, just let me know. We'll figure out how to make it better. So I think it's just some you remove that are most obvious, others you just discuss. And, I told you I was interviewed by one of the students from the school where there was a mass shooting, and she asked, should all of these course materials be removed for the entire time that students are in high school? And I said no, because then they're going to go to college, many of them, and no one's going to do that for them. So it is a balance, but I would say if you're unsure of the balance, ask the kids. They can actually provide very important input into that decision making.
Okay, here's another question. What do you say to an elementary level child who wants to be with the person who passed away?
Well, I think it depends on the age of the child. So when you're talking about kind of primary grades, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, they may still be solidifying their understanding of the concepts of death. Most of those concepts are learned by most children between 5 and 7 years of age. These concepts include irreversibility. When someone dies, they don't come back to life again. One of them is also called finality or non-functionality. When someone dies, all life functions cease. They don't breathe, they're not hungry, they're not in pain, they don't think. There's also a concept of causality, that they understand the cause of the death, and then inevitability, that all living things eventually die. Because if you don't know that all living things eventually die, then when someone you care about dies, you wonder why they were chosen to die, and that usually leads to belief that the person did something bad and has been killed as punishment, or that the child did something bad and someone they care about has been killed as punishment to them. And that just leads to guilt and shame. So you need to make sure that children understand those concepts. So when a child, let's say if you have a 5-year-old, or it's usually a little younger than that, so let's say a 4-year-old or a 3-year-old, if you tell them, for example, why don't you draw a picture and we'll put it in your mother's coffin, then the child may actually think that their mother can see that. To be quite honest, otherwise, why would you do it? It's symbolic, but children don't see the symbolism when they're very young. And they may figure, well, if my mom can see the picture, that means that she can see me. And it means that she might be hungry, you know, and we put her underground and it's dark and it's cold and she can't eat or she can't move. So you want to make sure that they're not preoccupied with physical suffering of deceased. So if they say they want to be with someone, then if they're very young, you need to clarify what they understand of that and why they're saying it. But for school-age children in general, they already know the concepts, and they may be voicing that they want to be with someone they care about. And that's kind of what I refer to as sometimes they're rhetorical questions, and they may be statements that they're just voicing what adults feel as well. I really miss someone that I love, and I'd like to be with them. And they may say, I want to be with them at this, you know, I want to visit them in the cemetery. They're really not visiting the person, they're going to a place where the person's buried, but that brings a lot of people solace and comfort. So I think I would ask why they want to visit and what they hope to gain from that. And then realize that if they're just voicing their longing to be with someone that they care about, that's okay. And you don't necessarily have to say anything except, I know it's hard, I know you miss your mom. That may be all that they're really looking for from you, is for that validation or the ability to talk about how they're feeling. So, other questions?
Tim?
This is Molly. Yep. You mentioned starting professional self-care now. How do you suggest self-care ideas to staff during the summer months?
Yeah. So, well, first off, self-care works best if you have an environment and a culture in your school where you've always valued it. And I think it needs to be communicated from the leadership of the school and become really an important part of the culture. And it also should be done in the context where you're providing support. There is a tendency sometimes for us to view self-care as the responsibility of the individual, as if we can create really challenging, difficult, overwhelming work environments. But if people get overwhelmed, it's because they haven't learned mindfulness or self-relaxation techniques, or, you know, we don't want to make, there is a personal responsibility for self-care, because if you don't take care of yourself, you can't really count on anyone else doing that. And there are certain parts of our self-care that only we can do for ourselves. But we need to set up an environment where care for our staff is an important priority and cultural element. So then what you want to do is, you know, there's certain types of supports that organizations can put in place, like having an employee assistance program, communicating that the needs of the adults are important. So for example, if they need to take off to go to a funeral, they're not penalized for that. So you want to set up organizational supports for educators. But in terms of for yourself, I think some of the steps are first some introspection, where you figure out for yourself how you think you're doing and what is most difficult for you. What is your challenge? Each person responds to these events differently, and our experiences are quite different. I personally don't think we grieve as a nation. I think we have a nation of people grieving themselves. They're very personal experiences. And so I've been seeing some in the chat about, well, what about racial issues that are coming up? That's going to disproportionately affect some people in different ways than others. But there's also financial impacts are differential. The nature of the loss is going to be different. Some people are more concerned about their own health, those that they live with. And so the way we are impacted is each different. And so I think what you might want to do is start by trying to reflect for yourself, what is most difficult for me and what would be most helpful? We all have different strategies and approaches for what's helpful. Some people like to talk, some people like to distract themselves. As you can imagine, if you have two people sheltering in place at home, and one likes distraction and the other likes talking, it's not a good combination, but that's what happens. I actually talked to one family. The child had died from cancer, and what one spouse did was liked running, jogging, running outside. The other one wanted to talk, and the one who wanted to talk thought that her spouse was literally running away from her. And so just having some conversation with those that you care about, you know, I know you want to talk about this all the time when you watch the news, but actually that just upsets me more. So could you please turn it off when I'm in the room? Or maybe we can have some time when we're together where we're doing something else and there is no discussion of the news. So I think figure out what works for you, figure out what your unique stressors are, make sure that you take some time to attend to them and nurture yourself so that you have the resources left, personal resources to help others. And, you know, each person I think is going to do that differently, but I'll refer people back because I discussed this on the last webinar and we have that module from the coalition material as well, but those are some general ideas.
What advice or resources would you have for parents and even possibly educators to speak with children about the social unrest in the communities right now regarding racial inequalities?
You know, this is something that has come up obviously because it's always been a pervasive issue and it's even more accentuated now. I don't know that we have anything in particular on the coalition website at this point that addresses that. We do talk about the fact that, you know, so for example, they're in the module that talks about cumulative loss. I focus on cumulative loss mainly in communities that have had disproportionate amounts of violence, often through gang-related violence. And a lot of those are communities of color and low socioeconomic groups. And we have to recognize they have a disproportionate share of loss, and that there's a tendency in some of those communities to just think that the children are used to it because it happens so much. I've gotten comments like that. I remember visiting one community that was known for its gang violence and high minority proportion of students and residents in the community. And they were talking about the fact this was after the shooting that had happened at Sandy Hook Elementary School. And they said, you know, people refer to it, you know, as a national tragedy when, you know, these number of children die. Here we call it a typical day in our community. And so I think the issue is that this is always, you know, these inequities are not new. I think people are just, that's part of why it's so frustrating, is it isn't new and we haven't made the progress that we should be making to rectify that. I remember I've been very involved in responding to Broward Public Schools after the shooting in Parkland at Marjory Stoneman Douglas. And I was invited to to speak to a congressional briefing on the afternoon before the March for Our Lives. And one of the comments I made was, every time I go to these school shootings that happen in communities that tend to have more privilege and tend to be less minority, So whether that's at Parkland or whether it's at Sandy Hook, my friends and colleagues say to me how outraged they are that something could happen in a community like that. And what I said at the briefing was, we should be outraged when it happens in any community. You know, the racial profile of the students is irrelevant. And so we have to start connecting with the fact that individuals who have experienced chronic loss are not used to this. They're just multiply traumatized by it. And that those are the kids who most need our help. Now, they may stop asking for it because they've recognized no one's going to give it to them when they bring it up in school. And so they may turn to gangs and to their peers for support and actually place themselves more at risk because they're afraid of dying. These are not kids who feel invulnerable. These are kids who recognize their mortality and need to challenge that. Counterphobic behavior, reactive risk-taking, they place themselves in risky situations to prove they can survive. It's because they're scared. So I think we have to first recognize that this problem is pervasive and does affect how children respond to loss. But in terms of talking specifically about you know, racial inequities, that isn't on our website, in part because I think these are really important topics, and I've been a little hesitant to try and put something together in a day or two to respond to current events. You'll see that the materials that are on our website have generally been developed over a couple of years. So I just want to make sure we have really high quality material, and that takes a while to develop for very sensitive topics. But it in no way is a reflection that we don't think it's important.
Thank you.
Okay, I got next question up here. Just want to do a quick time check. We've got 2 more questions in the queue right now, and there's about 10 minutes left. So first question in the chat, are there any specific books that we can read to children about loss, death, etc., specifically 4K through 3rd grade? And I'm wondering, Dr. Schonfeld, if just more generally for parents who are not trained in mental health, if you could speak to like ways and ideas to use resources like books, videos, websites, things like that for parents to use with their children.
Certainly. So books can often be used to raise the topic and to help facilitate conversation. To be quite honest, I find that when a child has experienced a close personal loss, that you can often talk with them about their experiences. The books, I think, are probably better when there isn't something that's just acutely happened and you need to bring up the conversation. But for children, if they've just experienced the death of their parent and they're 9 years old, you don't have to start talking about a dog that died in the book. I think you can talk to them about their experience that they've lived. Having said that, though, there are some very good books, particularly for young children, that teach some of those concepts I had talked about. I tend not to recommend particular books, in part because they go out of print fairly quickly, and there are a lot of them. And I've actually had situations where I've recommended a book and to a friend, and I later find out it's not in print, and they've spent so much time looking for it that, you know, what I'll do is I'll find a book and mail it to them. I'll order it to them, ship to them, but sometimes they're hard to find. What I do suggest is just go up to any children's librarian, particularly in schools. Chances are they know good books and they have them. I did a project, this was like 30 years ago, and I taught a curriculum for pre-kindergarten to second grade, and I had books which I read, and then at the end of the project, I got like 10 copies of the book that I had used, and I brought it to the librarian so that they would have it. And she just looked at me and said, why don't you just go put it with the other copies on the bookshelf? So she already knew about the book, already had it. I mean, but the teachers didn't know that. So what I would say is just speak to any children's librarian, a local bookstore. Just say, I'm looking for a book for a 7-year-old about death. What do you recommend? And just find a book and make sure that it covers those concepts and helps teach it. And then there are some materials that can be used for there's some books that are for teenagers, for example. The only thing that I would give as a caution is sometimes books are recommended about death when really they don't talk about dealing with death. They just have characters that die. Those are just more triggers and are not as helpful. So what you want to do is make sure that the book focuses on coping, adaptation, and adjustment. So, I think you had another question.
Yeah, we've had a few questions here about how to do this support virtually. Are there systems that people put in place or procedures like having a request for assistance form, particularly over the summer, where a family or student could request it? How do you do this sort of outreach when you're not in person with kids?
Right. So first off, the bereavement centers actually do have virtual groups, like we're working, this is on Zoom, for example, so some are using Zoom, where they have the kids get together and talk with each other, and they conduct the groups similar to what they would have done in person. There are ways of also doing virtual memorials. We're actually just working, I was trying to do that last night, was to more finalize some of our advice on how schools can do virtual memorials, maybe web pages that are dedicated to the memory of someone. There's a lot of issues, and that's what we're trying to sort out, is give advice to schools. Who pays for it, who maintains it, who can post it? Do you need permission to post things? There's lots of questions about how to do it. So we're trying to put some of those guidelines together. But for a school right now, if you have a student who has experienced a death, I don't want to make it sound too simplistic. Call them up, email them, say, I understand you've had a death. I'm so sorry. I'd like to talk with you. Would you like to speak? And then if you are a school mental health provider that feels comfortable running a group or doing individual support to a student, that's great. You can also let them know about the groups that are already in place in their community. As I said, you just go to the COVID-19 specific webpage that we have on both the Coalition and the National Center's website, and you'll find links on, you'll find that list of different types of challenges, and one of the resources is a resource listing of all the bereavement programs in each state. So Wisconsin will have a PDF, and then it breaks it down within Wisconsin to different communities, and then lists the names and the contact information for each of those sites. Was there any other questions?
I have the next one. What do you recommend for a student who is in middle school who is unwilling to talk to anyone about his dad's sudden death?
Part of it is that children, just like adults, often don't want to talk about it right when it's happened. So you let them know that you're there, that you're available. You might also want to ask them who else they think they can speak to at this point. And if they say no one, then you say, well, that's going to be very hard for you to deal with. So let's think about people that you might speak to. Let's go through some of your friends and family and see if you find someone that you think you can speak to now. And I'm here when you are ready to talk to me as well. So I think you make it known that you're there, that you're available. Sometimes kids will be resistant. They'll say, I don't need it. I'm fine. And it's a technique that I use that I just call gentle confrontation. I don't know if that's the right term. But if somebody says to me, I don't need to talk to anyone, I'm fine, then sometimes I say to them, well, I know you feel that you're doing fine, but you also told me you haven't been sleeping, and you also haven't been coming to class when we've had virtual classes. So maybe you're not doing quite as well as you thought you were. It's just gentle confrontation. I'm not telling you you're falling apart or that you're crazy or that you're doing any worse than anyone else would do. But I am telling you it sounds like you're still having some challenges, and maybe we can have someone help you with that. And then I think you have to wait. You just periodically check in. If you just say to someone, well, if you don't want to talk to me now, call me whenever you want, they generally don't call. So I say, if you don't want to talk to me now, I certainly understand that. I hope you'll find somebody else to talk to, and I'd like to help you think that through. And if you don't want to talk about it now with me, I'm going to check back with you next Monday, or I'm going to call you in 3 days. I just want to see how you're doing. And if you don't want to talk to me, you can keep telling me that, and that's okay. But I'm just going to let you know I'm still here. And when you're ready, I'm ready to talk with you as well. And so I think it's that continually being present without inserting yourself on them or pushing it, but letting them know that you're still there, you still care, and you're still available. And then you have to wait until they're ready to accept that invitation.
Thank you, Greg. I think we've cleared the chat box.
Terrific, and we've got 3 minutes to spare. So I just want to take a second and express my gratitude and thanks, Dr. Schonfeld, for your experiences and your expertise, your willingness to share with the folks here in Wisconsin. We look forward to continued communication with you, and also acknowledge the amazing job that Tracy, the interpreter, has done today. She has done an incredible job keeping up and delivering the message to a special population of care providers. Just a quick note, I'm going to put the link to our Google survey in the chat box to let us know whether you would like to continue these community of practice webinars beyond today. I would also like to remind you that this webinar was recorded, and once it has been closed captioned, it will be posted on the website. The other webinar is currently out for closed captioning, and it will be available in the near future. If we've got other folks that would like to ask a question, we've got about 2 more minutes. Lots of thanks coming in, Dr. Schonfeld, for your help and resources. In closing, Dr. Schonfeld, anything you'd like to add to wrap up?
No, I think the only thing I would say is that, first off, thank you so much for taking your free time to attend to this topic. I know that it is difficult, and I think it shows that educators know that they play a really important role in supporting kids at very difficult times, but it is hard. And so if it doesn't have an impact on you, it does have an impact on you. You may not recognize it yet. So please take care of yourself. So that we can keep taking care of the kids. And I'd like to say the worst is behind us, but I don't know that. So the best we can do is just help kids for where they're at in the best way we can at the moment. So thanks very much for joining me. Great,
thank you. The screen should now show the contact information for our SSPW mental health team. Please take the time to email us if you have questions. If you'd like to join our listservs and are not a member of those listservs yet, if you'd like to join the school counseling listserv, please email me, Greg Curtis, at dpi.wi.gov. If you'd like to join the SEL listserv, please email Beth Herman. School social worker listserv is managed by Julian City. School psychology website is managed by Timothy Perenboom, also known as Tim. And you can utilize Molly Herman and Elizabeth Krubsek to become a part of the school mental health listserv. So at this point, I see 11:30 on my clock. I want to thank everybody very much for your passion, your interest in this really important topic. And we look forward to continued communication and professional development as we move through this difficult time. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you.